The Spanish Empire helped create the first truly connected world. Silver mined in the mountains of the Americas, paid for goods in China, crossed the Pacific on Spanish ships, and ended up reshaping economies thousands of miles away. It was an empire so vast that decisions made in Madrid could affect villages in Mexico, ports in Peru, and markets in Manila. Yet the deeper historians look, the clearer one paradox becomes. The very global system that made Spain powerful also made its power fragile. An empire that connected continents also created problems no empire had ever faced before. If the Spanish Empire helped build the first global world, why did that same global system slowly weaken it? In the late 15th century, long before Spanish ships crossed entire oceans, the Iberian Peninsula had already lived through centuries of conflict, cooperation, and gradual transformation. For nearly 800 years, much of the peninsula had been shaped by the long struggle known today as the Reconquista, a series of shifting campaigns in which Christian kingdoms slowly expanded southward into territories ruled by Muslim states that had existed there since the early 8th century. By the late 1400s, this long historical process was approaching its final chapter. In 1492, the Christian forces of Castile and Aragon captured the city of Granada, the last Muslim-ruled kingdom on the peninsula. This moment did not simply end a military conflict. It reshaped the political and psychological horizon of the rulers who now governed a newly unified Spain. The rulers most closely associated with this turning point were Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, whose marriage in 1469 had linked two of the most powerful kingdoms of Iberia. Although their realms remained technically separate administrations, their partnership created a new political center strong enough to project power beyond the peninsula. Historians often emphasize that the completion of the Reconquista in 1492 gave these monarchs something unusual. A kingdom that had just finished a long territorial expansion within Europe and now possessed experienced soldiers, ambitious nobles, and a political culture accustomed to the idea that borders could continue moving outward. Yet expansion across the ocean was not an obvious next step. The rulers of Spain were still part of a European world whose trade routes, wealth, and political attention were largely oriented toward the Mediterranean and the overland connections to Asia. For centuries, valuable goods such as spices, silk, and porcelain had traveled along complex commercial networks that linked Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. These routes involved many intermediaries, and by the 15th century they were heavily influenced by powerful states such as the Ottoman Empire, which controlled key territories that connected Eastern Mediterranean trade to Europe. As a result, many European rulers were searching for alternative paths to the markets of Asia. Portugal had already begun exploring the coast of Africa earlier in the century, sending ships steadily farther south in hopes of finding a sea route around the continent that would eventually lead to India. Spanish rulers watched these developments carefully. The competition between Iberian kingdoms for influence, wealth, and prestige meant that Spain could not ignore the possibility that maritime exploration might reshape the balance of power. Yet Spain's interest in overseas exploration was not driven by a single clear strategy. Instead, it emerged from a mixture of religious motivation, political ambition, economic curiosity, and simple uncertainty about what might lie beyond the Atlantic Ocean. The year 1492, remembered for the fall of Granada, also became the year when the Spanish crown agreed to support a navigator named Christopher Columbus, whose proposal rested on a controversial geographical assumption that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic. Columbus was not the first person to imagine such a journey, but many scholars and navigators believed the distance would be far greater than he estimated. Even so, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to fund the expedition. Their decision reflected a willingness to gamble on the possibility that a westward route might open new connections to Asia's wealth. At the time, no one involved in the decision could clearly foresee that this voyage would lead to the creation of a vast transoceanic empire. The Spanish monarchy was not planning a global system, nor was it attempting to reshape the entire world economy. Instead, it was participating in a broader European moment in which maritime exploration was gradually expanding the known boundaries of geography. Yet, within a few decades, the consequences of this decision would begin to transform Spain from a regional European power into the center of an empire that stretched across continents. The process that followed would not happen all at once. It would unfold through voyages, settlements, conflicts, administrative experiments, and the gradual construction of networks that linked distant regions together. Understanding how Spain entered this new era requires returning to the moment when exploration first seemed possible, but not yet inevitable, when the Atlantic Ocean still appeared less like a bridge between continents and more like a vast, uncertain frontier. During the late 15th century, the Atlantic Ocean was still, for most Europeans, a space of uncertainty rather than opportunity. Medieval maps often depicted the known world as a relatively small region surrounded by vast oceans filled with speculation, legend, and incomplete information. Mariners certainly sailed the Atlantic along the coasts of Europe and North Africa, and islands such as the Azores, Madeira, and the Canary Islands had already been incorporated into European navigation networks. Yet beyond these familiar routes stretched a much larger ocean whose distances were poorly understood. What mattered for rulers like Ferdinand and Isabella was not only geography, but the changing economic landscape of the wider world. Europe's demand for Asian goods had been growing for centuries. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were especially valuable, not simply as flavoring but also for food preservation and medicinal uses. Silk, fine ceramics, and other luxury goods traveled along long trade chains that connected East Asia to the Middle East and eventually to European markets. Each step along these routes added cost, and by the time the goods reached Western Europe, they had become extremely expensive commodities. Italian trading cities such as Venice and Genoa had long benefited from their role as intermediaries in this system. For emerging monarchies on the Atlantic edge of Europe, including Spain and Portugal, the possibility of bypassing these networks offered both economic and political advantages. If a kingdom could establish direct maritime access to Asian markets, it could gain wealth while also weakening the commercial dominance of rival powers. Portugal's maritime explorations had already demonstrated that systematic ocean navigation was possible. Throughout the 15th century, Portuguese ships moved gradually down the western coast of Africa, establishing trading posts and gathering knowledge about winds, currents, and navigation techniques. By the 1480s, Portuguese mariners had reached the southern tip of Africa, and in 1498, Vasco da Gama would successfully sail to India. Spanish observers were well aware that Portugal's progress might soon give it control over a valuable oceanic trade route linking Europe and Asia. In this context, Christopher Columbus appeared at the Spanish court with an alternative idea. Columbus believed that the Earth was smaller than most scholars estimated, and that Asia could be reached much more quickly by sailing westward across the Atlantic. His calculations were controversial because they significantly underestimated the true distance between Europe and Asia in that direction. Many advisors at the Spanish court were skeptical of his proposal, and Columbus spent years attempting to secure support from different rulers before gaining serious attention in Spain. The decision by Ferdinand and Isabella to approve the voyage in 1492 did not reflect universal confidence in Columbus's theory. Instead, historians often describe it as a calculated risk taken during a moment when Spain had newly consolidated power after the fall of Granada. Funding a relatively small expedition required fewer resources than maintaining large military campaigns, and the potential reward, direct access to Asian markets, was considered worth the gamble. Columbus was granted titles and privileges in advance, including the promise that he would become an admiral and governor over lands he might discover. Such agreements reveal how uncertain the situation still appeared. The Spanish monarchy was preparing for the possibility of success without fully knowing what success would look like. When Columbus departed in August of 1492 with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, his expedition carried not only supplies and sailors but also a set of expectations shaped by the economic and political realities of late medieval Europe. The crew believed they were sailing toward Asia, and Columbus himself remained convinced of this interpretation for much of his life. Yet the voyage would soon bring them to islands in the Caribbean that were unknown to Europeans at the time. What began as an attempt to reach existing trade networks would gradually evolve into something very different, the beginning of sustained contact between Europe and the American continents. In the years that followed, Spanish expeditions returned repeatedly to the region, establishing settlements and gathering information about lands that European maps had never previously recorded. These developments did not immediately create a global empire, but they marked the first step toward a transformation that would soon connect distant parts of the world in ways that earlier generations had never imagined. In August of 1492, 3 small ships left the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera and moved slowly into the Atlantic. Compared with the enormous fleets that would later cross the ocean during the height of the Spanish Empire, this expedition was modest. The ships were not designed for long voyages across unknown seas, and their crews were composed mostly of experienced but ordinary sailors drawn from coastal communities of southern Spain. At the center of the expedition stood Christopher Columbus, a navigator whose confidence in his westward route rested on a set of calculations that many scholars believed were mistaken. Yet once the ships disappeared beyond the horizon, the expedition entered a part of the ocean that few European sailors had ever attempted to cross so directly. The Atlantic at that time was not entirely mysterious. Portuguese voyages had already revealed much about winds and currents along the African coast, and mariners understood the importance of patterns such as the trade winds that blow steadily from east to west near the equator. Columbus relied on this growing body of nautical knowledge, steering his ship southwest toward the Canary Islands before turning west into the open ocean. As the days passed, the crews encountered long stretches of calm water and floating seaweed in the region now known as the Sargasso Sea. For sailors accustomed to navigating coastlines, the experience of traveling for weeks without sight of land created understandable anxiety. Historical records from the voyage suggest that Columbus carefully managed the morale of his crew, sometimes recording shorter daily distances in the ship's log to prevent the sailors from realizing how far they had already traveled from Europe. The decision to continue westward required a mixture of discipline and trust, since turning back would mean abandoning the possibility of discovering the route they had been sent to find. On the 12th of October 1492, after more than 2 months at sea, the expedition sighted land. The island Columbus reached was part of the Caribbean, likely in what is now the Bahamas. He believed he had arrived near islands on the eastern edge of Asia and referred to the inhabitants as Indios, a term that reflected this mistaken geographical assumption. For the people already living in these islands, the arrival of the Spanish ships marked the beginning of a profound historical transformation. Columbus encountered communities belonging to the Taino culture, whose societies had developed across the Caribbean long before European contact. Early descriptions written by Columbus portray the islands as fertile and populated by people whom he believed could become trading partners or subjects of the Spanish crown. During the weeks that followed, Columbus continued exploring nearby islands, including parts of present-day Cuba and Hispaniola. He gathered information about local societies and searched for signs of the wealth he expected to find in Asia, particularly gold and spices. The expedition did discover small amounts of gold jewelry among the island communities, which reinforced Columbus's belief that larger sources of wealth might exist somewhere nearby. Before returning to Spain, Columbus established a small settlement called La Navidad on the island of Hispaniola, leaving a group of sailors behind while he sailed back to Europe with news of the voyage. When Columbus arrived in Spain in early 1493, he reported that he had reached lands across the ocean that could potentially provide valuable resources and opportunities for expansion. Although he still believed these islands were connected to Asia, the Spanish crown quickly recognized that the discoveries could have major political and economic implications. Additional expeditions were organized soon afterward, sending larger fleets across the Atlantic to establish permanent settlements and extend Spanish presence in the Caribbean. These early voyages did not yet reveal the full scale of the American continents, nor did they immediately create a global empire. What they did accomplish was something equally important. They opened a stable maritime pathway between Spain and lands across the Atlantic Ocean. Over time, that pathway would become one of the main corridors through which people, goods, ideas, and power moved between continents. The voyage that began with 3 ships searching for Asia had unintentionally connected 2 worlds that had developed separately for thousands of years. From that moment forward, the Atlantic would no longer be a distant frontier on the edge of European maps. It would become the central ocean of a rapidly expanding system of exploration, settlement, and conquest that would soon reshape the history of Spain and the wider world. When Christopher Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, the voyage was quickly presented to the royal court as a remarkable success. He had not brought back the spices or rich Asian markets that the expedition had originally hoped to find, but he did bring something that seemed just as promising: news of islands across the Atlantic that appeared fertile, populated, and potentially rich in resources. For Ferdinand and Isabella, this discovery arrived at a moment when Spain had just completed the Reconquista and was looking outward with new confidence. The monarchs immediately authorized a second expedition, and this time the scale was very different from the small voyage of 1,492. Instead of 3 ships, the new fleet included 17 vessels carrying more than 1,000 people. Among them were sailors, soldiers, craftsmen, priests, and administrators. The purpose of the journey had already changed. Columbus's first voyage had been an experiment in exploration. The second voyage was designed to establish a permanent Spanish presence across the ocean. When the fleet arrived in the Caribbean later that same year, the Spanish quickly learned that the fragile settlement Columbus had left behind at La Navidad had been destroyed. The sailors who had remained there had died during conflicts with local communities on Hispaniola. This early confrontation revealed an important reality. The arrival of Spanish expeditions was not simply an exchange between distant cultures. It was the beginning of a complex and often violent process in which Europeans attempted to establish authority over lands already inhabited by organized societies. In response, Columbus ordered the construction of a new settlement called La Isabela on the northern coast of Hispaniola. This became one of the first permanent European towns in the Americas. Life there was difficult from the beginning. The settlers faced unfamiliar climates, food shortages, disease, and tensions both within the Spanish community and with the local Taíno population. Many of the colonists had expected to find quick wealth, especially gold, but the reality of building a functioning settlement required hard labor and careful organization. Despite these challenges, the Spanish crown remained committed to expanding its presence in the Caribbean. Ships continued to cross the Atlantic, bringing new settlers and supplies. The islands gradually became staging grounds for further exploration. Spanish expeditions moved through the Caribbean Sea, mapping coastlines and searching for signs of the larger Asian territories that Columbus still believed must exist somewhere nearby. At the same time, the Spanish monarchy began developing systems to control and administer these distant lands. Communication between Spain and the Caribbean could take months, and royal officials needed reliable structures to maintain authority across such distances. Early colonial governance therefore relied heavily on appointed governors and local administrators who represented the crown's interests overseas. The Catholic Church also played a central role in these early settlements. Priests and missionaries traveled with many of the expeditions, and the Spanish crown viewed the spread of Christianity as both a religious duty and a justification for expansion. Conversion efforts began almost immediately in the Caribbean, though these efforts often occurred alongside systems that forced local populations into labor for Spanish settlers. These arrangements, later known as encomiendas, granted colonists the right to demand labor and tribute from indigenous communities in exchange for promises of protection and religious instruction. Over time, this system would become one of the defining structures of early Spanish colonial society. Yet during these first years in the Caribbean, the Spanish Empire, as it would later be known, still existed only in its earliest form. The settlements were small, The geography of the region remained poorly understood, and the Spanish crown did not yet realize the scale of the continents that lay beyond the islands. What had begun as a search for a westward route to Asia was slowly transforming into something much larger, the first steps toward a transoceanic system in which ships, people, and authority moved regularly between Spain and the Americas. The Caribbean islands, once unknown to European maps, were becoming the first foundations of a new and expanding world connected by the Atlantic Ocean. As Spanish settlements slowly took root in the Caribbean during the late 1490s and early 1500s, a new realization was beginning to form among European navigators and scholars. The lands Columbus had reached did not behave like the outer islands of Asia that many had expected to find. The geography seemed too vast, the coastlines too unfamiliar, and the cultures encountered by explorers did not resemble the societies described in European accounts of China, India, or the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. Each new voyage revealed more territory, larger islands, long continental coastlines, and rivers that stretched deep into unfamiliar interiors. Gradually, the possibility emerged that these lands might not be part of Asia at all, but something entirely different. One of the navigators who contributed to this changing understanding was Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine merchant and explorer who participated in voyages along the coast of South America in the early 16th century. In letters describing these journeys, Vespucci suggested that the lands across the Atlantic represented a previously unknown continent rather than the eastern edge of Asia. These ideas circulated widely in Europe, and by 1507, a group of German mapmakers produced a world map that labeled the new lands America, using a Latinized version of Vespucci's name. Although the process of understanding the true geography of the Atlantic world would take decades, this shift in perspective had important consequences for Spain. If the lands across the ocean were not simply islands on the way to Asia, but part of a vast new region, then the Spanish crown was no longer merely searching for trade routes. It was beginning to claim territories whose scale was still impossible to measure. Meanwhile, exploration continued at a steady pace. Spanish ships moved outward from the Caribbean, sailing along the coasts of Central and South America and mapping regions that had never appeared on European charts. Expeditions pushed along the northern coast of South America, into the Gulf of Mexico, and toward the Isthmus of Panama. These voyages gathered knowledge about winds, currents, and harbors, gradually transforming the Atlantic from a dangerous unknown into a navigable highway linking continents. At the same time, the Spanish crown attempted to regulate the growing flow of people and goods between Spain and the Americas. In 1503, the monarchy established an institution known as the Casa de Contratación in the city of Seville. This royal office was responsible for organizing voyages, registering ships, supervising trade, and collecting taxes from colonial commerce. It also maintained maps and navigational records, ensuring that the knowledge gathered from each expedition could be used by future sailors. Seville soon became the central port through which most Spanish traffic to the Americas passed. Ships departed from its docks carrying settlers, supplies, and administrators, while returning vessels brought reports, resources, and sometimes captured gold from the Caribbean islands. Although these shipments were still relatively small, compared with the enormous silver flows that would appear later in the century, they strengthened the Spanish crown's interest in maintaining a stable connection across the Atlantic. The Caribbean settlements themselves also began to change. Towns expanded slowly as new migrants arrived from Spain. Fields were cleared for agriculture, livestock were introduced from Europe, and colonial societies gradually formed around Spanish institutions and customs. Yet this growth came with profound consequences for the indigenous populations of the islands. Disease played a devastating role in this transformation. Illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and influenza diseases, long present in Europe, spread rapidly through communities in the Caribbean whose populations had no previous exposure to them. Combined with forced labor systems and social disruption, these epidemics led to dramatic population declines among indigenous societies during the early decades of Spanish colonization. These developments changed the nature of Spain's presence in the Atlantic world. What had begun as a series of exploratory voyages was evolving into a permanent colonial system that required new administrative structures, economic plans, and labor arrangements. The Caribbean became the first testing ground for these institutions. From these islands, Spanish expeditions would soon launch journeys toward much larger territories on the American mainland. By the second decade of the 16th century, rumors were already circulating among Spanish settlers about wealthy civilizations somewhere beyond the Caribbean Sea. These reports would soon draw ambitious adventurers later known as conquistadors toward the mainland, where encounters with powerful empires would transform Spain's Atlantic experiments into a far larger project of conquest. By the early years of the 16th century, the Spanish settlements scattered across the Caribbean had begun to function not only as colonies, but also as bases for further exploration. The islands of Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico gradually became centers from which Spanish expeditions organized voyages into surrounding waters. Ships sailed along unknown coastlines, gathered reports from local communities, and returned with stories that circulated quickly among settlers. These reports often described large lands beyond the islands, territories where powerful societies lived and where gold and other valuable goods might exist in greater quantities than the small amounts found in the Caribbean. For many Spanish settlers who had crossed the Atlantic hoping to find wealth and opportunity, such rumors were difficult to ignore. Life in the island colonies had proven far more demanding than many had expected. Agriculture required labor, supplies from Spain arrived slowly, and the gold deposits initially discovered on the islands were limited. As a result, many settlers began looking toward the mainland with increasing interest. The Caribbean therefore became a place where news, speculation, and ambition mixed together, creating an atmosphere in which new expeditions were constantly being proposed. Among the figures who listened closely to these reports were a group of men who would later become known as conquistadors. They were not official representatives of the Spanish crown in the way governors or royal administrators were. Instead, they were private adventurers who organized expeditions with the approval of colonial authorities, hoping to gain wealth, status, and land through exploration and conquest. Many of them had military experience from Spain's earlier campaigns during the Reconquista, while others were younger men drawn by the promise of opportunity in lands that Europeans barely understood. These expeditions were typically small and risky ventures. Leaders gathered crews of soldiers and sailors, secured ships, and negotiated agreements that promised a share of any wealth discovered during the journey. The Spanish crown often supported these ventures indirectly, granting legal permission for exploration while expecting that any newly claimed territories would ultimately fall under royal authority. In this way, exploration of the mainland developed through a combination of private ambition and imperial oversight. One of the early turning points came in 1513, when an expedition led by Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the narrow Isthmus of Panama. After traveling through difficult terrain, Balboa and his companions reached the shores of a vast ocean on the other side of the continent. Standing on a hill overlooking the water, Balboa claimed this ocean for the Spanish crown and named it the South Sea, which later became known as the Pacific Ocean. This moment revealed something important about the geography of the new lands. The territories encountered by Spanish explorers were not simply scattered islands, but part of a massive continental system stretching between two oceans. Knowledge of this geography quickly circulated among Spanish communities in the Caribbean. If a great ocean existed beyond the mainland, then the possibility remained that Asia might still be reachable by sailing west, through, or around these newly discovered lands. Yet at the same time, reports continued to emerge about powerful societies within the mainland itself. Indigenous traders and travelers sometimes described cities, markets, and rulers who governed large populations. These stories reached Spanish settlements through complex networks of communication, often becoming more dramatic as they passed from one group to another. Although many details were uncertain, the overall impression suggested that the mainland might contain far richer territories than the islands of the Caribbean. By the late 1510s, the stage was set for a new phase in Spain's Atlantic expansion, The Caribbean colonies had provided the logistical base, the navigational experience, and the political structures necessary to support larger expeditions. Adventurers were already preparing to sail toward the mainland in search of wealth and influence. Within a few years, one of these expeditions would reach the shores of a powerful civilization in central Mexico, setting in motion a chain of events that would dramatically expand Spanish power in the Americas. What had begun as scattered exploration across unfamiliar seas was about to transform into a series of confrontations with societies whose scale and complexity would surprise even the most ambitious conquistadors. In 1519, a Spanish expedition sailed westward from the island of Cuba toward the mainland of what is now Mexico. The leader of this expedition was Hernán Cortés, a Spanish nobleman who had arrived in the Caribbean years earlier seeking opportunity in the expanding Spanish colonies. Like many other conquistadors of his generation, Cortés was not acting as a representative of a large royal army sent directly from Spain. Instead, his expedition resembled many earlier ventures organized from the Caribbean, a privately led enterprise supported by soldiers, sailors, and settlers who hoped that success might bring them wealth, land, and social advancement. Cortés's fleet consisted of several ships carrying a few hundred men, along with horses, weapons, and supplies. Although small in number, these expeditions were able to travel quickly and adapt to unfamiliar situations, relying heavily on alliances, local information, and negotiation as much as military force. When Cortés and his companions first landed along the Gulf Coast of Mexico, they encountered communities that were part of a complex political landscape. The region was not a single unified state, but a network of city-states, alliances, and tributary relationships connected to a powerful empire centered inland. This empire was ruled by the Mexica people, known more widely today as the Aztec Empire, whose capital city of Tenochtitlan stood on an island in Lake Texcoco. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan had become one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that may have reached 200,000 people. The city was connected by causeways and canals, and it served as the political and economic center of an empire that collected tribute from numerous surrounding regions. Spanish accounts, written later, often describe the city with a mixture of admiration and astonishment, noting its markets, temples, and carefully planned urban layout. Yet the Aztec Empire was not simply a distant civilization waiting to be discovered. It was already deeply involved in regional politics that affected many neighboring communities. Some of these communities were allies of the Mexica rulers, while others resented the tribute demands and military pressure imposed by the empire. When Cortés began communicating with local groups along the coast, he quickly learned about these rivalries. Through interpreters, most famously a woman known as Malintzin, or Doña Marina, who played an important role in translation and diplomacy, Cortés gained valuable information about the political divisions within the region. Rather than immediately attempting to attack the Aztec Empire directly, Cortés pursued alliances with indigenous groups who were willing to oppose the authority of Tenochtitlan. One of the most significant alliances formed with the Tlaxcalans, a powerful confederation that had long resisted Aztec domination. These alliances dramatically changed the balance of power. Although the Spanish expedition itself included only a few hundred Europeans, the combined forces of Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies could number in the thousands during major confrontations. As Cortés and his allies moved inland toward the Valley of Mexico, the expedition entered territories where news of their arrival had already spread. Reports about unfamiliar visitors arriving with ships, horses, and metal weapons circulated among regional leaders, sometimes blending observation with rumor. By the time Cortés approached the great city of Tenochtitlan in late 1519, the encounter between Spanish explorers and the Aztec Empire had become one of the most remarkable meetings of societies in early modern history. For the Spanish, the city represented a level of urban complexity and wealth that exceeded their expectations. For the Aztec rulers, the arrival of foreigners, accompanied by rival indigenous groups, introduced a new and uncertain element into the political balance of the region. The meeting between Cortés and the Aztec ruler, Moctezuma II, marked the beginning of a tense and unpredictable relationship that would soon escalate into conflict. What followed over the next 2 years would reshape the political map of central Mexico and dramatically expand Spain's influence in the Americas. Yet at the moment when Cortés and his companions first entered Tenochtitlan, the final outcome of this encounter remained uncertain, and the fate of both societies had not yet been decided. When Hernán Cortés and his allies approached the Valley of Mexico in late 1519, the journey had already carried them across mountains, valleys, and cities that revealed the scale of the world they had entered. Spanish soldiers recorded their surprise at the organized towns, cultivated fields, and busy roads they encountered along the way. Many of these settlements were part of the vast network connected to the Aztec Empire. Tribute from these regions flowed toward the imperial capital of Tenochtitlan, reinforcing the authority of its ruler, Moctezuma II. Yet the same system that created imperial power also created tensions. Communities required to deliver tribute or provide labor sometimes viewed the empire with resentment, and these divisions had already shaped the alliances Cortés formed during his march inland. By the time the expedition reached the valley surrounding Lake Texcoco, Cortés was accompanied not only by a few hundred Spanish soldiers, but also by thousands of indigenous allies from regions such as Tlaxcala. The final approach to Tenochtitlan was unlike anything the Spanish had seen before. The city stood on an island connected to the mainland by long causeways crossing the shallow lake. Canoes moved constantly across the water, transporting goods and people between the city and surrounding communities. Spanish accounts describe how the city appeared to rise from the lake itself, its temples and buildings reflecting sunlight across the water. For the Europeans, who had expected to find scattered settlements or trading posts similar to those in the Caribbean, the scale of Tenochtitlan was deeply surprising. Many of the soldiers later compared it to major European cities they knew, emphasizing its markets, canals, and carefully arranged streets. Cortés and his companions entered the city in November of 1519, where they were received by representatives of Moctezuma II before eventually meeting the emperor himself. The exact nature of this meeting has been debated by historians for centuries because the surviving descriptions come mainly from Spanish sources written after the conquest had already occurred. According to these accounts, Moctezuma welcomed the visitors with ceremony and hospitality, offering gifts and allowing them to remain in the city as guests. From the Aztec perspective, receiving foreign visitors through ritual exchange and diplomatic courtesy was not unusual. Leaders throughout Mesoamerica often used formal hospitality as a way to observe and evaluate outsiders before deciding how to respond. Yet the presence of armed foreigners, accompanied by rival indigenous groups, created an unusual situation that neither side fully understood. During the weeks that followed, relations between the Spanish expedition and the Aztec leadership became increasingly tense. Cortés recognized that remaining in the city without securing his own position would leave his small force vulnerable. At one point, he placed Moctezuma under Spanish custody within the palace where the Spaniards were staying. The emperor continued to communicate with his officials, but the situation effectively placed the political center of the Aztec Empire under the influence of a small foreign group. Meanwhile, events outside the city were also beginning to change the situation. News arrived that another Spanish expedition had landed on the Mexican coast, sent by colonial authorities from Cuba, who were concerned about Cortés acting without clear authorization. Cortés temporarily left Tenochtitlan to confront this new force, eventually persuading many of the soldiers to join his expedition instead. While he was away, tensions inside the city escalated into violence. Spanish soldiers left behind in Tenochtitlan clashed with Aztec inhabitants during a religious festival, an event that triggered widespread anger throughout the city. When Cortés returned, the fragile balance that had allowed the Spanish to remain in Tenochtitlan had collapsed. The city that had once welcomed the foreigners as guests was now preparing to drive them out. What followed would soon become one of the most intense conflicts of the early Spanish conquests, transforming the encounter between Cortés and the Aztec Empire into a prolonged struggle for control of the region. The violence that erupted inside Tenochtitlan transformed the situation completely. The Spanish forces, once guests within the city, suddenly found themselves surrounded by a population that had turned openly hostile. As tensions escalated, Moctezuma II lost the ability to calm the growing unrest. Spanish accounts later described attempts to use the emperor's authority to persuade the people of the city to remain peaceful, but by this stage the political order that had once held the empire together was already breaking apart under the strain of conflict and uncertainty. During the chaotic weeks that followed, the Spanish and their allies realized that remaining inside Tenochtitlan had become increasingly dangerous. In June of 1520, Cortés and his forces attempted to escape the city under cover of night. This retreat, later remembered in Spanish sources as La Noche Triste, or the Night of Sorrows, turned into a desperate struggle along the narrow causeways that connected the island city to the mainland. As Spanish soldiers and their allies attempted to withdraw, Aztec warriors attacked from canoes and from the surrounding roads. Many Spaniards carrying heavy equipment and gold taken from the city were unable to move quickly through the shallow waters and canals. Numerous soldiers were killed during the escape, and much of the treasure they had gathered was lost in the lake. The retreat demonstrated that the Spanish expedition was far from invincible. Cortés and the survivors eventually reached friendly territory among their indigenous allies, particularly the Tlaxcalans, where they regrouped and planned their next move. During the months that followed, Cortés began preparing for a renewed campaign against Tenochtitlan. The strategy relied heavily on cooperation with indigenous allies who had long opposed the Aztec Empire. Thousands of warriors from Tlaxcala and other regions joined the Spanish forces, providing the majority of the troops that would take part in the coming siege. Cortés also ordered the construction of small ships known as brigantines, which were assembled on the shores of Lake Texcoco. These vessels allowed Spanish and Allied forces to move across the water, cutting off supply routes and challenging Aztec control of the lake surrounding the capital. In 1521, the campaign to retake Tenochtitlan began in earnest. Spanish and Allied forces advanced along the causeways while brigantines patrolled the lake. The fighting was intense and lasted for months as Aztec defenders resisted the siege. Houses and temples were damaged during repeated battles, and the city's population faced severe shortages of food and clean water. Another factor also influenced the course of events: disease. Smallpox, introduced to the region during earlier contact with Europeans, had already spread through parts of central Mexico. The epidemic weakened communities across the region, including within Tenochtitlan itself, and disrupted the leadership structure of the Aztec Empire during a critical moment of war. By August of 1521, the siege had reached its final stage. After months of combat and growing shortages, organized resistance within the city began to collapse. The last Aztec ruler, Cuauhtémoc, was eventually captured while attempting to escape across the lake. With his capture, the long struggle for the city came to an end. Tenochtitlan, once one of the largest urban centers in the world, had been devastated by the siege. In the years that followed, the Spanish would rebuild the city as Mexico City, establishing it as the administrative center of a vast new colonial territory known as New Spain. The fall of Tenochtitlan did not immediately give Spain control over all of central Mexico, but it marked a decisive turning point. The conquest demonstrated that relatively small Spanish forces, working with large indigenous alliances and exploiting regional divisions, could defeat powerful political systems in the Americas. News of the victory spread quickly across the Atlantic, encouraging further expeditions and conquests in other parts of the continent. What had begun as scattered exploration from the Caribbean had now produced the first major continental conquest of the Spanish Empire, dramatically expanding Spain's influence and opening a new phase in the Age of Global Conquest. After the fall of Tenochtitlan in 1521, the Spanish presence in central Mexico entered a very different phase. Conquest alone could not sustain an empire. The Spanish crown now faced a challenge that would shape the future of its growing territories: how to govern lands thousands of kilometers away, inhabited by millions of people whose political systems, languages, and traditions were entirely unfamiliar to European rulers. What had once been a fast-moving expedition led by conquistadors now had to become something slower and more organized. Administration, law, taxation, and religion all needed to be established in regions that Spain had only recently begun to understand. In the years following the conquest, the ruins of Tenochtitlan were gradually transformed into a new colonial capital. Spanish builders dismantled damaged temples and palaces, using the stones to construct churches, administrative buildings, and houses designed according to Spanish urban traditions. Over time, the city became known as Mexico City, serving as the political center of a vast colonial territory called New Spain. From this location, Spanish officials attempted to manage lands that stretched far beyond the Valley of Mexico, including regions that had previously been connected to the Aztec Empire, as well as territories that Spanish explorers were still beginning to map. Governing such a large and distant region required a new political structure. Initially, much authority remained in the hands of conquistadors like Hernán Cortés, who expected rewards for their role in the conquest. Cortés himself was granted large estates and titles, and many of his companions received land or labor rights in newly conquered territories. Yet the Spanish crown soon recognized a potential problem. If powerful conquistadors controlled large territories independently, they might eventually challenge royal authority. The monarchy, therefore, began creating institutions designed to ensure that colonial power ultimately remained under the control of the king. One of the earliest of these institutions was the Royal Audiencia, a governing council made up of judges and administrators who supervised colonial affairs and enforced Spanish law. The Audiencia served both as a court and as a political body capable of limiting the influence of individual conquistadors. Over time, additional layers of administration were introduced. The Spanish crown divided its territories into large regions governed by officials known as viceroys. These men acted as representatives of the king himself, responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and supervising military defense. The creation of the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1535 formalized this structure, placing Mexico and its surrounding territories under a centralized colonial administration. Communication between Spain and its American territories remained slow. Messages sent across the Atlantic could take months to arrive, and colonial officials often had to make decisions without immediate instructions from the crown. To manage this challenge, the Spanish monarchy relied heavily on written reports, legal documents, and bureaucratic systems that allowed information to flow between continents. Colonial administrators regularly sent detailed accounts back to Spain describing local conditions, economic activities, and political developments. In return, royal decrees issued in Madrid gradually shaped the structure of colonial society. Religion also played a central role in this process of imperial organization. Missionaries from several Catholic orders, including the Franciscans, Dominicans, and later the Jesuits, traveled to New Spain with the goal of spreading Christianity among indigenous populations. Churches, monasteries, and mission settlements appeared throughout the region. These institutions often served not only as centers of worship, but also as places where Spanish authorities attempted to reshape local communities according to European legal and social traditions. In practice, colonial rule involved a constant negotiation between Spanish institutions and indigenous societies that had long histories of their own governance. Local leaders sometimes maintained positions of authority within colonial systems, while Spanish officials depended on existing community structures to collect tribute and organize labor. The result was a complex political landscape in which European imperial ambitions interacted with long-established indigenous traditions. As the Spanish monarchy refined these systems of control, it was gradually building something new in world history, an empire that connected distant continents through administration, law, religion, and trade. The conquest of the Aztec capital had opened the door, but the long-term stability of Spanish power would depend on whether these institutions could successfully govern a growing network of territories across the Atlantic. As Spanish authority expanded across central Mexico during the 1520s and 1530s, governing the land was only one part of the challenge. The Spanish crown also needed a system that could organize labor, collect tribute, and support the growing colonial economy. Conquest had brought vast territories under Spanish control, but those territories contained societies with their own traditions of agriculture, trade, and local leadership. Rather than replacing these systems entirely, Spanish authorities often adapted them, reshaping existing structures to serve the needs of the new colonial administration. One of the most important systems introduced during the early decades of Spanish rule was known as the encomienda. This arrangement granted Spanish settlers the right to receive tribute and labor from specific indigenous communities. In theory, the system came with responsibilities. The Spanish holder of an encomienda was expected to protect the community placed under his authority and ensure that its members received instruction in Christianity. In practice, however, the system frequently became a source of exploitation. Indigenous communities were often required to provide agricultural labor, mining work, or other services that supported the colonial economy. For many Spanish settlers, an encomienda represented both wealth and social status, and competition for these grants could be intense. The Spanish crown itself had a complicated relationship with this system. On one hand, encomiendas rewarded the conquistadors and settlers who had helped establish Spanish control in the Americas. On the other hand, the monarchy worried that powerful encomenderos might gain too much independence if they controlled large numbers of workers and large areas of land. Throughout the 16th century, royal officials attempted to regulate the system, sometimes limiting the inheritance of encomiendas or adjusting the rules governing labor obligations. These efforts reflected a broader pattern in the Spanish Empire, the monarchy constantly balancing the ambitions of colonial settlers with the need to maintain centralized royal authority. Economic activity in New Spain gradually expanded beyond tribute and agriculture. Spanish settlers introduced new livestock such as cattle, sheep, and horses, which changed both the landscape and the economic life of many regions. Farms and ranches appeared around colonial towns, producing food for growing urban populations, as well as goods that could be traded across the Atlantic. At the same time, Spanish authorities recognized that the American continents contained valuable mineral resources. Small amounts of gold had already been collected in the Caribbean, but the most significant discoveries would soon come from silver deposits located in the interior of the continent. Even before those major mining centers were fully developed, colonial administrators were already preparing systems that could support large-scale extraction of mineral wealth. This preparation required roads, transport networks, and reliable labor supplies capable of sustaining demanding work in mines and processing centers. The development of towns became an essential part of this economic structure. Spanish colonial cities were often designed according to planning principles that followed a grid pattern with a central plaza surrounded by churches, administrative buildings, and marketplaces. From these towns, officials organized taxation, trade, and legal administration. Indigenous communities frequently remained in nearby settlements, continuing agricultural production while interacting with colonial authorities through tribute systems and labor arrangements. Over time, this network of cities and rural communities created a stable framework that allowed goods and information to move throughout the region. Religion remained closely tied to these developments. Missionaries continued traveling into newly incorporated territories, establishing churches and schools where Christian teachings were introduced alongside Spanish language and customs. Some missionaries also became vocal critics of the harsh treatment faced by indigenous populations under colonial systems. Figures such as Bartolomé de las Casas argued that indigenous communities should be protected from exploitation and that Spanish rule should follow Christian principles of justice. His writings sparked debates within Spain about the moral responsibilities of empire, debates that influenced royal policies and legal reforms in the colonies. These discussions did not end exploitation, but they reveal that the Spanish Empire was constantly negotiating the meaning of its own authority. By the middle of the 16th century, New Spain had developed into a functioning colonial society supported by agriculture, tribute, religious institutions, and an expanding administrative system. Yet even as this structure became more stable, new discoveries were about to transform the entire economic foundation of the Spanish Empire. Deep within the mountains of the Americas, enormous deposits of silver would soon begin to flow into the global economy, linking Spain not only to the Americas but also to distant markets across the world. During the middle decades of the 16th century, the structure of Spain's American empire began to change in a way that few people had anticipated during the early years of conquest. For decades, Spanish settlers in the Caribbean and Mexico had searched for precious metals, hoping to find deposits similar to the small quantities of gold that had been gathered in the islands. What they eventually discovered was something far larger and more consequential: enormous reserves of silver hidden within the mountainous interior of the Americas. These discoveries would transform the economic foundation of the Spanish Empire and gradually connect distant regions of the world through a growing network of trade. One of the most important discoveries occurred in 1,545 inches to the highlands of present-day Bolivia, where a mountain known as Cerro Rico, near the settlement of Potosí, revealed vast silver deposits. The location sat high in the Andes, more than 4,000 meters above sea level, yet the promise of silver quickly drew thousands of people to the area. Within a few years, Potosí had grown into one of the largest cities in the Americas and one of the most important mining centers in the world. At roughly the same time, other major silver deposits were discovered in northern New Spain, particularly around Zacatecas in modern-day Mexico. These mining regions soon became essential pillars of the Spanish imperial economy. Extracting silver from these mines required large numbers of workers and complex logistical systems. Ore had to be dug from deep tunnels, transported to processing centers, and refined into usable metal. Colonial authorities, therefore, expanded labor systems capable of supporting the mining industry. In some regions, indigenous communities were required to provide labor through tribute obligations or rotating work drafts. In the Andes, a system known as the mita, adapted from earlier Inca practices, required communities to send workers to the mines for fixed periods of service. Conditions in these mines were often extremely difficult, particularly at high altitudes or in deep underground tunnels where air and light were limited. At the same time, Spanish entrepreneurs introduced new technologies that increased the efficiency of silver production. One of the most important methods was the patio process, developed in the 1550s, which used mercury to separate silver from crushed ore. This innovation allowed lower-grade ore to be processed more effectively, dramatically increasing the total amount of silver produced. As production expanded, entire regional economies began to revolve around the mining industry. Towns developed around supply routes, farms produced food for mining communities, and merchants organized transport networks that carried refined silver toward major ports. From these ports, fleets of Spanish ships transported silver across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. The arrival of American silver in Spain had far-reaching consequences. The precious metal helped finance the ambitions of the Spanish monarchy, which during the 16th century ruled not only Spain and its American territories, but also large parts of Europe through the Habsburg dynasty. Silver shipments supported military campaigns, royal administration, and international trade, yet the effects extended beyond Spain itself. Much of this silver eventually circulated through European markets and traveled even farther, reaching regions as distant as the Ottoman Empire, India, and China. In this way, silver from the mines of the Americas began linking continents into a global economic system that had never existed before. The empire that Spain was building was therefore not only territorial but also economic. Ships crossed the Atlantic in regular convoys, merchants organized trade routes that connected distant ports, and colonial cities became centers where goods, information, and people moved between continents. What had once been isolated discoveries across the ocean were now forming part of a vast imperial network. By the late 16th century, silver from the Americas had become one of the most important drivers of global trade. Yet this wealth also introduced new challenges. The sudden influx of precious metal affected prices across Europe and created economic pressures that Spanish rulers struggled to manage. The same silver that made the Spanish Empire powerful would also begin to reveal the hidden fragility of a system built on resources extracted from distant lands. Understanding how this silver transformed global trade will lead directly into the next stage of the story, where the Spanish Empire becomes the central link connecting the Americas, Europe, and Asia. By the second half of the 16th century, the silver mines of the Americas had begun producing metal on a scale that few people in Europe had previously imagined possible. Shipments of silver left ports in the New World each year, carefully organized into fleets that crossed the Atlantic under armed protection. These convoys, known as the Spanish treasure fleets, sailed from major colonial ports such as Veracruz in New Spain and Portobello in the region of modern Panama. From there, the ships carried chests of refined silver towards Spain, usually arriving at the port of Seville, which had become the central gateway between the Spanish Empire and the wider Atlantic world. The journey across the ocean was long and often dangerous. Storms, navigation errors, and the threat of piracy made every voyage uncertain, yet the Spanish crown developed an elaborate system designed to reduce these risks. Ships traveled together in large fleets rather than individually, allowing them to defend one another if attacked. Carefully scheduled departures also ensured that colonial merchants and administrators could prepare their shipments in advance. Over time, these fleets became one of the most recognizable features of the Spanish imperial system, symbolizing the steady flow of wealth from the Americas into Europe. When the silver arrived in Spain, its effects were felt almost immediately across the European economy. Coins minted from American silver entered markets throughout the continent, making it easier for merchants to conduct long-distance trade. Yet the sudden abundance of precious metal also created economic changes that were difficult to control. Prices for goods began rising across Europe during the 16th century in a phenomenon historians now call the price revolution. As silver increased the overall supply of money in circulation, the cost of food, clothing, and everyday goods gradually climbed higher. This meant that although Spain possessed enormous quantities of silver, the purchasing power of that wealth did not always grow at the same pace. The Spanish monarchy relied heavily on these shipments to support its political ambitions in Europe. During the reign of the Habsburg kings, particularly Charles V and later Philip II, Spain was deeply involved in conflicts across the continent. Armies had to be paid, fortifications built, and diplomatic alliances maintained. American silver provided the financial resources that allowed Spain to act as one of the dominant powers of 16th-century Europe. Yet much of this silver did not remain in Spain for long. It quickly moved outward again through trade and financial networks, linking Spanish merchants to bankers and traders in cities such as Antwerp, Genoa, and Amsterdam. These merchants used silver to purchase goods from many different regions of Europe and beyond. In this way, the metal mined in the mountains of Mexico and the Andes began circulating through a vast commercial system that extended far beyond Spanish territory. Gradually, Spanish silver became one of the most important currencies of global commerce. Merchants trusted its consistent purity, and coins such as the Spanish silver peso, often called pieces of 8, were accepted in markets far from the Atlantic world. These coins appeared in ports along the Mediterranean, in trade centers across the Middle East, and even in distant Asian markets. For the first time in history, a single flow of precious metal was linking economies across multiple continents. The Spanish Empire had unintentionally created a financial bridge connecting the resources of the Americas to the commercial systems of Europe and Asia. Yet this system also introduced new complexities. The Spanish crown depended heavily on silver shipments, but the empire's growing military commitments consumed enormous amounts of that wealth. At the same time, merchants were discovering that the greatest demand for silver existed not only in Europe, but in Asia, where large economies, especially China, used silver as a primary form of currency. This realization would soon reshape the direction of Spanish trade routes. Instead of moving only across the Atlantic, Spanish ships would begin crossing the Pacific Ocean as well, linking the silver of the Americas with the markets of Asia. Through this connection, the Spanish Empire would become a central participant in what historians often describe as the first truly global trading system. As silver continued to arrive in Europe from the mines of the Americas, merchants gradually discovered something unexpected about the global demand for this metal. While European markets certainly used silver for coinage and trade, the greatest and most consistent demand for large quantities of silver existed much farther away in Asia. In particular, the economy of Ming-era China had increasingly adopted silver as a key medium for taxation and commercial exchange. During the 16th century, Chinese authorities required many taxes to be paid in silver rather than in goods or traditional copper currency. This policy created a steady need for large amounts of the metal, and merchants across Asia began seeking reliable supplies wherever they could find them. For Spanish traders, this demand represented an opportunity that slowly became clearer over time. The silver produced in the Americas was already traveling across the Atlantic to Europe, but some merchants realized that a direct connection between American silver and Asian markets might prove even more profitable. The difficulty, however, lay in geography. Sailing from Europe to Asia usually required a long journey around Africa, a route already dominated by Portuguese merchants. Spain needed another path if it hoped to participate directly in Asian trade. That path began to emerge through continued exploration of the Pacific Ocean after the discovery of its vast waters earlier in the century. Spanish expeditions moving westward from Mexico gradually learned more about the ocean's wind patterns and currents. These voyages were difficult and dangerous, and for many years sailors struggled to identify a reliable return route across the Pacific. A breakthrough came in 1565, when the navigator Andrés de Urdaneta discovered a workable path for ships traveling from Asia back to the Americas by sailing north into favorable winds before crossing the ocean eastward. This discovery made regular trans-Pacific voyages possible. Soon afterward, Spain established a permanent trading connection between the port of Acapulco in New Spain and the city of Manila in the Philippine Islands. Manila had become a Spanish settlement after an expedition led by Miguel López de Legazpi reached the islands in the 1560s. The city quickly developed into a major commercial center where merchants from across Asia gathered to exchange goods. Chinese traders arrived with silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and other valuable products that were highly desired in European and American markets. Merchants from Southeast Asia and India also participated in this growing marketplace. Spanish ships began sailing regularly between Acapulco and Manila, carrying large quantities of silver from the mines of Mexico. These vessels became known as the Manila galleons. The journey across the Pacific could take several months, and the ships often carried enormous cargoes packed tightly into their holds. When they arrived in Manila, much of the silver was exchanged for Asian goods, particularly Chinese silk and porcelain. The ships then returned to Mexico loaded with these products, which were transported across the land route to Veracruz and eventually shipped onward to Spain. Through this system, the silver of the Americas began flowing directly into Asian markets, while Asian goods moved steadily toward Europe and the Americas. The Manila galleon trade therefore created one of the earliest continuous commercial links connecting three continents, the Americas, Asia, and Europe. Goods, currency, and cultural influences traveled along these routes, forming networks that stretched across half the globe. Spanish colonial cities such as Mexico City and Manila became central nodes within this expanding system, where merchants from different regions exchanged products and information. Yet even as this global exchange grew more regular, the Spanish Empire faced a new reality. The wealth flowing through its territories was increasingly shaped by distant markets beyond Spain's direct control. Silver mined in American mountains could end up in Chinese marketplaces thousands of kilometers away, and decisions made by merchants in Asia could influence the flow of goods throughout the empire. The Spanish imperial system had become part of a global economy whose scale and complexity were larger than any single government could fully direct. By the late 16th century, the route between Manila and Acapulco had become one of the most remarkable trade corridors in the early modern world. Each year, usually one or two large ships departed from Manila carrying cargo that represented the commercial activity of an entire region of Asia. These ships, known as the Manila galleons, were among the largest vessels of their time. Built to withstand long ocean voyages, they were designed with deep hulls capable of carrying enormous quantities of goods across the Pacific. The voyage itself was demanding. After leaving Manila, the galleons sailed northward into the open Pacific, seeking the strong winds that could carry them east toward the American continent. Weeks would pass with little sight of land as the ships moved through vast stretches of ocean. Sailors had to navigate storms, changing currents, and the constant challenge of maintaining supplies during a journey that could last 3 or 4 months. Yet, despite these difficulties, the route gradually became predictable enough that merchants could plan their activities around its yearly rhythm. When the galleons finally approached the coast of New Spain, they usually arrived at the port of Acapulco. There, one of the most important trading events in the Spanish Empire took place, the annual Acapulco Fair. Merchants from across the colonies traveled to the port to purchase goods brought from Asia: silks woven in China, porcelain from Jingdezhen, spices from Southeast Asia, and finely crafted objects from across the Asian trading world were unloaded from the ships and displayed in warehouses and marketplaces. Buyers from Mexico City and other colonial towns negotiated purchases that would soon travel across land routes toward the Atlantic coast. From Acapulco, mule trains carried Asian goods across the mountains of Mexico to Veracruz, the major Atlantic port of New Spain. There they joined the cargo of the Spanish treasure fleets sailing back to Europe. By the time these goods reached Spanish markets, they had traveled halfway around the globe. A piece of Chinese porcelain, for example, might move from a kiln in eastern China to Manila by regional traders, cross the Pacific aboard a Spanish galleon, pass through the markets of Mexico, and finally arrive in Spain months or even years after it had first been produced. This remarkable chain of movement illustrates how the Spanish Empire functioned as a bridge linking distant regions of the world. Silver played a central role in keeping this system running. Merchants in Manila were especially eager to receive silver from the Americas because it was widely accepted in Asian markets. Chinese traders, in particular, valued silver as a reliable form of payment. As a result, much of the silver transported across the Pacific quickly entered commercial networks across East Asia. The metal moved through Chinese markets, where it supported taxation, trade, and everyday economic exchange. In return, Asian merchants supplied the luxury goods that European and American buyers desired. Through this process, the Spanish Empire became one of the first political systems to sustain regular trade across both the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Yet the system was not entirely controlled by Spain itself. While Spanish authorities supervised the ships and regulated the official routes, many of the goods and trading relationships were managed by merchants from different cultures and regions. Chinese traders, Filipino communities, Spanish colonial officials, indigenous workers in the Americas, and European merchants all participated in the exchange. The Manila galleons, therefore, represented more than a simple shipping route. They were part of a much larger network of cooperation, negotiation, and economic opportunity that extended across continents. By connecting the silver of the Americas with the markets of Asia and the consumers of Europe, the Spanish Empire helped create an economic web that stretched around the globe. This system would continue operating for more than 2 centuries, shaping patterns of trade and cultural exchange that influenced societies far beyond Spain's political borders. Yet the same global connections that brought wealth and opportunity also introduced new pressures into the empire. As trade networks expanded and economic flows became more complex, the Spanish monarchy faced the growing challenge of maintaining control over a system that had become truly global in scale. By the late 16th century, the Spanish Empire was no longer defined only by conquest or by distant flows of silver. It had become a living network of cities, roads, farms, ports, and communities spread across several continents. Within this expanding world, daily life unfolded in places where people from very different backgrounds lived close to one another. Spanish officials, indigenous communities, African laborers, Asian merchants, missionaries, and settlers all contributed to societies that had never existed before the age of global conquest. To understand how the empire truly functioned, it is necessary to step away from battles and royal decrees and look instead at the ordinary rhythms of life inside its colonial cities. One of the most important centers of this world was Mexico City. Built upon the foundations of the former Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, the city gradually became the largest and most influential urban center in the Americas under Spanish rule. Its streets were laid out according to Spanish urban planning, with a central plaza surrounded by government buildings, churches, and marketplaces. Yet beneath this Spanish design remained traces of the earlier city. Canals, causeways, and indigenous neighborhoods continued to shape the urban landscape, creating a place where older traditions and new colonial institutions existed side by side. Every day, markets across the city filled with activity. Farmers from surrounding communities brought maize, vegetables, fruits, and other goods to sell in crowded plazas. Merchants offered cloth, tools, ceramics, and imported products from distant regions of the empire. A piece of silk might have traveled from China through Manila and Acapulco before appearing in a shop in Mexico City. At the same time, locally produced goods moved outward through trade networks connecting towns and rural settlements. These markets formed the economic heartbeat of colonial society, where people of many backgrounds interacted through buying, selling, and negotiation. Social life within the Spanish Empire was organized through a complex system of status and identity. At the top of colonial society were people born in Spain, known as peninsulares, who often held the highest administrative and church positions. Just below them were criollos, individuals of Spanish ancestry who had been born in the Americas. Although many criollos were wealthy landowners or merchants, they were sometimes excluded from the most powerful government roles, which remained closely tied to Spain itself. Below these groups were a wide range of communities formed through centuries of cultural contact. Indigenous peoples continued to live in large numbers throughout the colonies, maintaining many of their local traditions while also interacting with Spanish institutions. African laborers, many of whom had been transported through the Atlantic slave trade, contributed to agricultural work, mining, and urban labor in several regions of the empire. Over time, these diverse populations created new cultural identities through intermarriage and social exchange. Colonial societies, therefore, included people identified as mestizos, mulattoes, and other categories that reflected the mixture of European, indigenous, and African ancestry. Religion formed another shared structure within this diverse world. Catholic churches stood at the center of most colonial towns, and religious festivals often shaped the rhythm of public life. Missionaries continued to travel into rural regions, teaching Christian beliefs, while also adapting their message to local languages and traditions. In many places, indigenous communities blended older cultural practices with Christian rituals, creating forms of religious expression that reflected both traditions. These interactions produced a cultural landscape that was neither entirely European nor entirely indigenous, but something new created through continuous exchange. The Spanish Empire, therefore, was not simply a political structure controlled from distant royal courts. It was a network of communities where daily life brought together people from different continents and traditions. Markets, churches, farms, and households all formed part of this system, revealing how global connections shaped the experiences of ordinary individuals. Within these spaces, the broader forces of empire, trade, administration, and cultural change became part of everyday life, quietly linking distant parts of the world through the routines of people who might never travel far from their own city streets. Within the expanding cities and towns of the Spanish Empire, society gradually organized itself into a layered structure that reflected both Spanish traditions and the realities of life in the Americas. These layers were not only about wealth or occupation, They were also connected to ideas about birthplace, ancestry, and social identity. Over time, colonial administrators and local communities developed a system often described as the caste system, a way of categorizing people according to their family origins within the diverse populations of the empire. Although this system appeared clearly defined in official documents and paintings of the period, everyday life was often more fluid and complex than these categories suggested. At the highest level of colonial society were the peninsulars, Spaniards who had been born on the Iberian Peninsula and later traveled to the Americas. Because they were seen as closest to the authority of the Spanish crown, many of the most powerful government and church positions were reserved for them. Viceroys, high-ranking bishops, and senior royal officials usually belonged to this group. Their authority helped maintain the connection between colonial territories and the monarchy in Spain. Yet even within this privileged group, life in the colonies could be demanding. Administrators had to manage distant territories with limited communication from Europe, and many spent years navigating the complex relationships that defined colonial politics. Just below the peninsulares were the criollos, people of Spanish ancestry who had been born in the Americas rather than in Spain itself. Over time, criollos became an influential part of colonial society. Many owned farms, mines, or businesses, and were deeply involved in the economic life of the empire. They often received education in colonial universities and participated in local government councils known as cabildos. Despite their wealth and status, however, criollos sometimes found themselves excluded from the highest imperial offices, which remained largely reserved for officials sent from Spain. This tension between locally born elites and administrators appointed from Europe would gradually become more significant in later centuries. Indigenous communities continued to form the largest population groups across many parts of the empire. In numerous regions, Spanish authorities allowed indigenous towns to maintain certain elements of their traditional leadership structures. Local leaders known as caciques sometimes worked with colonial officials to organize tribute payments and community responsibilities. Many indigenous communities retained their languages, agricultural traditions, and local forms of governance, even while participating in colonial systems of taxation and labor. These communities were therefore not simply passive subjects of empire, but active participants in shaping how colonial society functioned on a daily basis. Alongside these groups were people whose lives reflected the complex cultural mixing that had emerged from centuries of contact. Individuals of mixed ancestry, such as mestizos, who had both Spanish and indigenous heritage, or mulattoes, who had European and African ancestry, formed growing parts of urban and rural populations. These communities often worked in skilled trades, agriculture, transportation, or commerce. Some became merchants, artisans, or soldiers, contributing to the economic and social life of colonial towns. Their experiences demonstrated that colonial society was constantly evolving as new identities emerged from interaction between different cultural traditions. African populations also played an important role in several regions of the Spanish Empire. Beginning in the 16th century, enslaved Africans were transported to parts of the Americas to work in agriculture, mining, and urban labor. Although their experiences were shaped by systems of forced labor, African communities also contributed languages, religious practices, music, and cultural traditions that became part of colonial life. In cities such as Mexico City, Havana, and Cartagena, African and Afro-descendant communities formed visible and influential parts of urban society. Through all these layers of identity and status, everyday life continued to revolve around familiar routines. Markets opened at dawn, church bells marked the hours of the day, and caravans of merchants traveled between towns carrying goods from one region to another. Within these rhythms, the Spanish Empire revealed its most distinctive characteristic. It was a world where people from different continents were now living within the same social and economic system. The global networks created by conquest and trade had quietly reshaped daily life, producing societies that reflected a mixture of traditions, languages, and histories that had once existed far apart. Across the cities, towns, and rural communities of the Spanish Empire, cultural life gradually developed through constant interaction between traditions that had once existed on separate continents. The empire's global networks did not only move silver, silk, and spices, they also carried languages, foods, artistic styles, and religious practices that slowly blended into new forms of everyday life. In colonial societies such as those in Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean, these influences could often be seen in ordinary details: the design of buildings, the sounds of different languages spoken in markets, and the foods prepared in family kitchens. Architecture offers one of the clearest examples of this cultural blending. Spanish settlers initially built churches, government buildings, and homes according to architectural traditions familiar in Spain. Stone churches with bell towers, arcaded plazas, and grid-shaped streets appeared in many colonial towns. Yet these structures were often constructed by indigenous craftsmen who brought their own artistic techniques and design traditions into the process. As a result, many colonial churches display decorative patterns and carvings that reflect both European and indigenous artistic influences. In regions such as Mexico and the Andes, this combination produced architectural styles that were unique to the colonial world, neither entirely Spanish nor entirely indigenous. Language also reflected the mixture of cultures within the empire. Spanish became the official language of administration and government, and missionaries often used it in their efforts to teach Christianity. However, indigenous languages continued to be spoken widely in many communities. In central Mexico, for example, Nahuatl remained an important language for communication and trade well into the colonial period. Missionaries sometimes learned local languages in order to translate religious texts and communicate with indigenous populations more effectively. Over time, everyday speech in colonial towns often included words and expressions drawn from several languages, illustrating how cultural exchange occurred through ordinary conversation. Food provided another space where traditions from different regions met and adapted to one another. Spanish settlers introduced animals such as cattle, pigs, and chickens, along with crops including wheat, onions, and certain fruits that had previously been unknown in the Americas. At the same time, indigenous agricultural knowledge remained central to daily life. Crops such as maize, beans, tomatoes, and cacao continued to form the foundation of local diets. Colonial kitchens, therefore, became places where ingredients from different continents were combined. Dishes prepared in Spanish households might include both European livestock and indigenous grains, while local markets sold foods that reflected the agricultural diversity of the new colonial world. Religion also evolved through this process of interaction. Catholicism remained the official religion of the Spanish Empire, and missionaries worked to establish churches and Christian institutions across colonial territories. Yet religious life in many communities incorporated elements from earlier spiritual traditions. Festivals honoring Catholic saints sometimes took place on dates that had previously been important in indigenous ceremonial calendars. Artistic representations of Christian figures occasionally included symbols or visual styles familiar to local populations. These adaptations helped communities understand new religious ideas within the context of their own cultural experiences. Through such gradual changes, colonial societies developed religious practices that reflected both European teachings and local traditions. Music and celebration further revealed the mixture of cultures within the empire. Religious festivals, weddings, and community gatherings often included instruments and rhythms from several cultural backgrounds. Spanish string instruments, indigenous percussion traditions, and African musical influences could all appear within the same performance. Over time, these interactions produced new musical forms that were unique to the colonial Americas. The blending of these sounds reflected the broader reality of life in the Spanish Empire. People from different continents were now sharing spaces where cultural exchange happened naturally through daily interaction. In this way, the Spanish Empire became more than a political system connecting distant territories. It also became a cultural environment where traditions met, adapted, and evolved together. Languages shifted, cuisines expanded, artistic styles changed, and religious life took on new meanings. These changes did not occur all at once, nor were they always peaceful or balanced. Yet over generations they created societies that reflected the complex connections formed during the Age of Global Conquest. Understanding these cultural transformations reveals how the empire shaped not only trade routes and political power, but also the everyday experiences of the people who lived within its vast and interconnected world. While the Spanish Empire created vast networks of trade and cultural exchange, its expansion also carried profound human consequences. Behind the movement of silver fleets and the construction of colonial cities lay a much harsher reality for many of the people who lived within the empire's territories. Conquest had brought Spanish authority to regions inhabited by millions of indigenous people, and the process of transforming these lands into colonial societies placed heavy demands on local populations. Understanding the Age of Global Conquest, therefore, requires looking not only at its achievements, but also at the costs that accompanied imperial expansion. One of the most immediate consequences of Spanish colonization was the dramatic decline of indigenous populations across many parts of the Americas. When Europeans arrived, they carried diseases such as smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus illnesses that had circulated for centuries in Europe, Africa, and Asia, but had never previously reached the American continents. Because indigenous communities had no prior exposure to these diseases, they had little natural immunity. As a result, epidemics spread rapidly through towns and villages, often with devastating effect. Historical research suggests that in many regions the population declined sharply during the first century after European contact. Entire communities were disrupted as families lost members, agricultural systems struggled to recover, and social structures that had existed for generations were suddenly weakened. Disease alone, however, does not fully explain the transformation that occurred during this period. Colonial labor systems also played a major role in shaping the experiences of indigenous communities. As Spanish settlements expanded, colonial authorities required labor to support agriculture, mining, construction, and transportation networks. Systems such as the encomienda and later labor drafts placed many indigenous communities under obligations to provide tribute or work for Spanish settlers. In some regions, these demands were limited by royal regulations intended to prevent excessive exploitation. In practice, however, enforcement varied widely depending on local conditions and the priorities of colonial administrators. For many indigenous families, the combination of disease, tribute obligations, and social disruption created a period of deep hardship. Mining regions, in particular, placed heavy demands on labor. In the Andes, the silver mines of Potosí required thousands of workers to operate tunnels, transport ore, and process silver using new refining techniques. Colonial authorities adapted earlier systems of rotational labor to recruit workers from surrounding communities, sending them to the mines for periods of service. The work was physically demanding and often conducted in harsh conditions at high altitudes. While some workers were paid wages, many experienced the system as an obligation tied to colonial rule. The mines therefore became one of the most visible symbols of the economic transformation taking place within the Spanish Empire. At the same time, it is important to recognize that indigenous societies did not simply disappear or remain passive under colonial rule. Many communities adapted to the new political environment in ways that allowed them to preserve important aspects of their traditions and local authority. Indigenous leaders sometimes negotiated with colonial officials to reduce tribute demands or protect community lands. Local legal systems occasionally allowed indigenous communities to present petitions and complaints to colonial courts, where disputes over labor or taxation could be reviewed. These interactions reveal that colonial society was shaped not only by Spanish power, but also by the strategies indigenous communities used to survive and maintain continuity within a rapidly changing world. The realities of colonial labor and population decline also sparked debates within Spain itself. Missionaries, scholars, and government officials began asking difficult questions about the moral responsibilities of empire. Some argued that indigenous populations deserved protection under Christian law and that colonial systems needed reform to prevent abuse. These discussions would eventually influence new laws and policies issued by the Spanish crown. Although such reforms did not eliminate the hardships faced by many communities, they demonstrate that the Spanish Empire was not entirely united in its views about how colonial rule should be carried out. The Age of Global Conquest, therefore, contained a complex mixture of expansion, wealth, and human struggle. The same imperial networks that connected continents also produced deep challenges for the societies drawn into their reach. As reports from the Americas reached Spain during the 16th century, they did not only describe new lands, silver mines, and expanding trade, they also carried troubling accounts about how indigenous communities were being treated under colonial systems. Missionaries, administrators, and travelers wrote letters and reports describing forced labor, population decline, and the social disruption that had followed the rapid expansion of Spanish authority. These reports sparked a series of debates within Spain itself, debates that reveal something unusual about the Spanish Empire. Even as the empire expanded across continents, some of its own scholars and religious leaders began questioning whether conquest and colonization were being carried out in a morally acceptable way. One of the most influential voices in these discussions was the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas had first traveled to the Caribbean in the early years of Spanish colonization and initially participated in the colonial system himself. Like many settlers, he held an encomienda that granted him access to indigenous labor. Over time, however, his views changed dramatically. After witnessing the conditions faced by many indigenous communities, Las Casas began arguing that colonial systems were causing severe harm and that indigenous peoples should be recognized as free human beings with legal rights under Christian law. In his writings and speeches, Las Casas insisted that the people of the Americas were capable of governing themselves and deserved protection rather than exploitation. He believed that Spanish expansion should focus on peaceful conversion to Christianity rather than conquest through violence or forced labor. His arguments gained attention in Spain, where church leaders and royal officials were already discussing how imperial authority should be exercised across distant territories. The concerns raised by Las Casas and other missionaries eventually contributed to a famous debate known as the Valladolid debate in the mid-16th century. This discussion took place in Spain and involved scholars and theologians who attempted to answer a difficult question: what rights did indigenous peoples possess under Spanish and Christian law? On one side of the debate stood Las Casas, who argued that indigenous communities had full human dignity and should not be enslaved or violently subjugated. On the other side was the scholar Juan Ginés de Sepulveda, who claimed that Spanish rule could be justified if it was intended to bring order, Christianity, and civilization to societies he believed were less developed. The debate did not produce a simple resolution, but it demonstrated that the Spanish Empire was actively confronting moral questions about its own expansion. As these discussions continued, the Spanish crown introduced a series of legal reforms aimed at limiting abuses in colonial systems. One of the most significant measures was the new laws of 1542. These laws attempted to reduce the power of encomienda holders by restricting the inheritance of labor grants and strengthening protections for indigenous communities. Royal officials hoped that these reforms would prevent colonial settlers from establishing permanent systems of forced labor, yet implementing these policies across distant territories proved difficult. In some regions, colonists resisted the changes because they believed their economic livelihoods depended on access to labor. The result was a long period of negotiation between colonial authorities, settlers, and indigenous communities over how these laws should be applied in practice. Despite these challenges, the debates themselves had lasting importance. They demonstrated that the Spanish Empire was not simply expanding through conquest and trade without reflection. Within the empire, religious thinkers, administrators, and scholars were attempting to define the ethical boundaries of imperial rule. Their discussions did not end the hardships experienced by many indigenous communities, but they influenced later legal traditions concerning human rights, colonial governance, and the responsibilities of imperial power. These debates reveal another dimension of the age of global conquest. While ships crossed oceans and armies reshaped political landscapes, intellectual arguments about justice, morality, and human dignity were unfolding at the same time. The Spanish Empire, therefore, was not only a system of global expansion, it was also a place where difficult questions about power and responsibility were being asked for the first time on a truly global scale. Over time, the combination of disease, labor demands, and social disruption reshaped the demographic landscape of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. During the century following the first encounters between Europeans and indigenous societies, many regions experienced dramatic population changes. Communities that had once formed the political and agricultural foundations of powerful civilizations were forced to adapt to new realities created by colonial rule. Fields that had long been cultivated by large local populations sometimes stood partially abandoned, while Spanish settlers and administrators searched for new ways to organize labor and production within their growing colonial economies. These demographic shifts had long-term consequences that extended far beyond the early years of conquest. As indigenous populations declined in some regions, colonial authorities increasingly looked for other sources of labor. One of the systems that expanded during this period was the transatlantic slave trade. Beginning in the early 16th century and growing more significantly over time, enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic to work in Spanish colonies. These individuals were brought primarily to regions where plantation agriculture or urban labor required large workforces. In the Caribbean and parts of mainland Spanish America, African communities became an essential part of colonial society. Their labor contributed to agriculture, construction, transportation, and other forms of economic activity that supported the empire's growing network of cities and trade routes. The arrival of African populations added another layer to the cultural and social complexity of the Spanish Empire. African languages, musical traditions, religious practices, and craftsmanship influenced the cultures of colonial towns and rural communities. Over generations, African descendants formed communities of their own while also interacting with indigenous and European populations. The resulting cultural exchange created new traditions that reflected the combined histories of several continents. Music, religious festivals, and local customs often carried traces of African influence alongside indigenous and Spanish elements, demonstrating how cultural identity in the colonial world continued to evolve. At the same time, indigenous societies continued adapting to the new colonial environment in ways that allowed many communities to survive despite enormous challenges. Agricultural systems were reorganized, local leadership structures adjusted to colonial administration, and communities found ways to maintain traditions within the framework of Spanish rule. In some areas, indigenous towns became important suppliers of food and goods for nearby Spanish settlements. Markets allowed indigenous farmers and artisans to participate in regional trade, providing opportunities for economic activity even as tribute obligations remained part of colonial life. These developments reveal that colonial society was not static. It changed continuously as different populations interacted with one another and responded to shifting economic demands. The Spanish Empire relied on these evolving communities to sustain the systems that supported its global networks of trade. Mines required workers, cities needed food and materials, and merchants depended on the steady movement of goods between regions. Each of these activities depended on the labor and knowledge of people who lived within the empire's territories. By the end of the 16th century, the societies of Spanish America had become deeply interconnected through systems of work, trade, and cultural exchange. Yet these societies also carried the lasting effects of the upheavals that had accompanied conquest. Population loss, forced labor systems, and the arrival of enslaved populations had permanently altered the structure of communities across the Americas. The empire that Spain had built was therefore both a powerful engine of global connection and a place where many groups struggled to adjust to a world transformed by imperial expansion. As the Spanish Empire continued to grow, these underlying tensions would become increasingly important. The wealth generated by global trade and mining brought enormous influence to Spain, but it also created economic and political pressures that would gradually challenge the stability of the empire itself. By the early 17th century, the Spanish Empire still stretched across an enormous portion of the globe. Its territories extended from the mountains of the Andes to the cities of Mexico, from Caribbean ports to the distant trading center of Manila in the Pacific. Silver continued to leave the mines of the Americas, fleets still crossed the Atlantic, and Spanish rulers remained among the most powerful monarchs in Europe. On maps of the period, the empire appeared almost unstoppable. Yet beneath this impressive image, subtle problems were beginning to emerge, problems that would slowly weaken the foundations of Spanish power. One of the most important pressures came from the very wealth that had once strengthened the empire. American silver had provided Spain with vast financial resources, but the constant flow of precious metal also created economic imbalances. As silver entered European markets in large quantities, prices gradually rose across the continent. This process, known today as the price revolution, meant that everyday goods such as food, clothing, and tools became more expensive over time. Although Spain possessed enormous amounts of silver, the rising cost of goods reduced the real value of that wealth. In effect, the empire had more money, but that money often purchased less than it had before. At the same time, Spain's rulers were involved in numerous political and military conflicts across Europe. The Spanish monarchy, under the Habsburg dynasty, controlled territories not only in Spain and the Americas but also in parts of Italy, the Low Countries, and other regions connected through dynastic alliances. Maintaining this network required constant military spending. Armies had to be paid, ships built and maintained, fortifications strengthened, and alliances negotiated with other European powers. These commitments consumed enormous amounts of silver arriving from the Americas. Much of the wealth that flowed into Spain therefore left again almost immediately, passing through royal treasuries to support wars and diplomatic obligations across the continent. The structure of Spain's economy also created additional challenges. Unlike some other European powers that were beginning to expand manufacturing and commercial industries, Spain relied heavily on imported goods. Merchants used American silver to purchase textiles, weapons, and manufactured products from other European regions, particularly from places such as the Netherlands and northern Italy. As a result, silver often flowed out of Spain to pay foreign producers. The empire's wealth was therefore circulating through international markets, rather than building a strong domestic industrial base. Another difficulty came from the enormous size of the empire itself. Governing territories spread across several continents required complex administrative systems and reliable communication between distant regions. Messages traveling between Spain and the Americas could take months to arrive, and decisions made in Madrid were often implemented slowly or unevenly across colonial territories. Local officials sometimes had to act independently when faced with urgent problems, which occasionally led to conflicts between colonial interests and royal authority. Maintaining order across such a vast geographic area required constant effort and coordination. Competition from other European powers also began increasing during this period. England, France, and the Dutch Republic were developing their own maritime capabilities and commercial networks. These rivals sought access to overseas trade routes and colonial territories that Spain had previously dominated. Pirates and privateers sometimes targeted Spanish treasure fleets, hoping to intercept the valuable cargoes of silver traveling across the Atlantic. Although Spain continued to defend its shipping routes, the growing presence of rival powers signaled that the age of uncontested Spanish dominance was slowly coming to an end. These challenges did not cause the Spanish Empire to collapse suddenly. In many ways, the empire remained strong throughout much of the 17th century. Silver still flowed from American mines, colonial cities continued to grow, and global trade routes remained active. Yet the pressures created by economic imbalance, military commitments, and imperial competition were gradually reshaping the system that Spain had built during the Age of Conquest. The empire that had once expanded rapidly across oceans was now entering a new phase, one in which maintaining global power would become increasingly difficult. As the 17th century progressed, the Spanish Empire faced a new reality that had not existed during the early decades of conquest. Other European powers had been closely observing Spain's success overseas, and many of them had begun building their own maritime capabilities. England, France, and the Dutch Republic were developing stronger navies, expanding commercial fleets, and searching for opportunities to enter the same global trade networks that Spanish ships had dominated for more than a century. The oceans that had once seemed like Spain's exclusive pathways were gradually becoming contested spaces where multiple powers competed for influence. One of the earliest challenges came from the Dutch Republic. During the late 16th century, the Netherlands had rebelled against Spanish rule in a conflict that eventually led to the formation of an independent Dutch state. This conflict was not only fought on European battlefields. Dutch merchants and sailors began attacking Spanish shipping routes across the Atlantic and Pacific, targeting the flow of silver and goods that connected Spain's empire. Dutch privateers captured merchant ships, disrupted trade routes, and even established their own commercial networks in Asia. In 1602, the Dutch government created the Dutch East India Company, a powerful trading corporation that quickly became one of the most influential commercial organizations in the world. Through this company, Dutch merchants gained access to Asian markets that had previously been dominated by Iberian traders. England also began expanding its presence on the seas during this period. English sailors and merchants sought access to the wealth generated by global trade, and some of them turned to privateering as a way to challenge Spanish dominance. Privateers were privately owned ships authorized by their governments to attack enemy commerce during times of conflict. One of the most famous English figures involved in these activities was Sir Francis Drake, whose voyages in the late 16th century included attacks on Spanish settlements and ships carrying treasure from the Americas. Although such raids did not destroy Spain's global system, they demonstrated that other European powers were increasingly capable of reaching Spanish territories across the oceans. France soon joined this competition as well. French merchants and explorers established settlements in parts of North America and the Caribbean, seeking opportunities to participate in Atlantic trade. French ships also appeared in regions where Spanish influence had once been nearly uncontested. Over time, these new colonial ventures allowed France to build commercial and agricultural economies of its own in the Americas. The Caribbean, in particular, became a region where multiple European powers established colonies that produced sugar and other valuable crops. These new settlements began competing with Spanish territories for access to markets and trade routes. The rise of these rival powers had several important consequences for Spain. First, it meant that the oceans were no longer secure corridors controlled by a single empire. Spanish fleets had to travel with greater caution, and maintaining naval defenses became increasingly expensive. Second, competition encouraged other nations to develop their own colonial systems, which gradually reduced Spain's dominance in global trade. Regions that had once been closely tied to Spanish commerce now found themselves interacting with merchants from many different countries. Finally, these rival powers began building their own global networks that linked Europe to Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The Spanish Empire was no longer the only force shaping the emerging global economy. Yet despite these challenges, Spain's imperial system did not disappear. Silver continued to flow from American mines, colonial administrations remained in place, and Spanish cities across the Americas remained important centers of trade and governance. The empire still possessed enormous resources and influence. What had changed was the balance of power in the wider world. The age when Spain stood almost alone as the leading global empire was gradually giving way to a more competitive international landscape. Multiple nations were now participating in the process of global expansion, each seeking access to the wealth and opportunities created by the connections between continents. These shifts marked an important turning point in the history of the Spanish Empire. The global system that Spain had helped create was continuing to grow, but it was no longer shaped by Spain alone. By the later decades of the 17th century, the Spanish Empire still remained one of the largest political systems in the world, yet the pressures building inside the empire had become increasingly difficult to ignore. Wealth continued to arrive from the mines of the Americas, but the system that supported this wealth was growing more fragile. Maintaining fleets, defending colonial ports, governing distant territories, and supporting wars in Europe required enormous financial resources. At times, the Spanish monarchy found itself spending silver faster than it could collect it. Royal treasuries faced repeated financial crises, and the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy several times during the 16th and 17th centuries when debts to bankers could no longer be paid on schedule. These crises did not mean that Spain was poor, but they revealed how dependent the empire had become on the steady arrival of American silver. Another long-term challenge emerged from the structure of Spain's imperial economy. Much of the wealth generated by the empire came from extracting resources, especially silver, from colonial territories. While this system produced enormous amounts of precious metal, it did not always encourage the development of diversified industries within Spain itself. Manufacturing centers in northern Europe, particularly in the Dutch Republic and parts of England, were producing textiles, tools, and ships more efficiently than Spanish producers. As a result, Spanish merchants frequently used silver to purchase these goods from abroad rather than producing them domestically. Over time, this pattern strengthened the economies of Spain's rivals, while leaving Spain increasingly dependent on imported products. Meanwhile, the very size of the empire continued to complicate the work of governance. Territories stretched from the Philippines in Asia to Peru and Mexico in the Americas, with Spain itself at the center of this vast network. Communication across such distances was slow and uncertain. Orders sent from Madrid might take months to reach colonial officials, and conditions in distant regions could change before instructions arrived. Local administrators often had to rely on their own judgment when responding to crises, which sometimes created disagreements between colonial governments and royal authorities in Spain. In practice, the empire functioned through a delicate balance between centralized royal power and the local decisions of officials scattered across the globe. At the same time, the societies within Spanish America were continuing to evolve. Colonial cities had grown into complex urban centers with active markets, universities, and religious institutions. Local elites, especially criollos born in the Americas, were becoming more influential in regional politics and economic life. These elites often felt a strong connection to their local communities while also remaining part of the Spanish imperial structure. Over time, this dual identity would create new political tensions, as locally powerful groups sometimes questioned the authority of administrators sent from Spain. Yet during the 17th century, these tensions remained mostly contained within the existing imperial framework. Despite all these pressures, the Spanish Empire did not collapse or disappear. Instead, it slowly adapted to changing circumstances. Colonial economies continued functioning, trade routes remained active, and the imperial administration maintained authority across large parts of the Americas and the Pacific. The empire that Spain had built during the Age of Conquest proved remarkably durable, capable of surviving economic strain and growing international competition. Yet the nature of its power had changed. The early decades of rapid expansion had created a system that connected continents through trade, administration, and culture. Now that same global system was becoming more complex and more difficult for any single empire to control completely. Spain still stood at the center of many of these connections, but the world it had helped create was no longer shaped by Spanish power alone. The age of global conquest had given birth to a truly interconnected world, and that world was beginning to follow paths that even the Spanish Empire could not fully direct. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the world that the Spanish Empire had helped connect was beginning to move in new directions. The great networks of trade that stretched across the Atlantic and Pacific were still active, and Spanish territories in the Americas continued producing silver, agricultural goods, and manufactured products for international markets. Yet the center of economic energy within this global system was slowly shifting. New commercial powers were rising in Europe, and their growing influence began reshaping the balance that had once favored Spain. One of the most visible changes occurred in the world of maritime commerce. During the early Age of Conquest, Spain and Portugal had dominated long-distance ocean travel, controlling many of the routes that connected Europe with the Americas and Asia. By the 17th century, however, merchants and shipbuilders in northern Europe had developed highly efficient commercial fleets. The Dutch Republic in particular became famous for its powerful merchant navy. Dutch ships were built to carry large cargoes at relatively low cost, allowing merchants to move goods across long distances more frequently than many of their competitors. These commercial advantages helped Dutch traders establish themselves in markets throughout Europe, Asia, and the Atlantic world. England followed a similar path. English shipyards expanded rapidly, producing fleets capable of supporting both trade and naval defense. Merchants from English ports began participating actively in Atlantic commerce, transporting goods between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Over time, England also established colonies of its own along the eastern coast of North America and in parts of the Caribbean. These settlements produced commodities such as tobacco and sugar that were in high demand in European markets. As these colonial economies grew, England's participation in global trade expanded significantly. The rise of these new commercial powers did not immediately eliminate Spanish influence, but it gradually reduced Spain's ability to dominate global markets. Regions that had once depended primarily on Spanish shipping began trading with merchants from multiple nations. Caribbean waters, once patrolled mainly by Spanish fleets, now hosted ships flying many different flags. The Atlantic Ocean was becoming a shared commercial space where several empires competed for access to trade routes and resources. Within Spanish territories themselves, economic life continued adapting to these new realities. Colonial merchants often found it profitable to trade with foreign ships that arrived in American ports, even when official Spanish law attempted to restrict such exchanges. Smuggling became a common feature of colonial commerce, especially in regions where official supply ships from Spain arrived only occasionally. Local traders sometimes preferred the cheaper manufactured goods offered by Dutch or English merchants, creating informal trade networks that operated alongside Spain's official imperial system. At the same time, the Spanish crown attempted to reform its administration in order to strengthen imperial control. Officials introduced new regulations designed to improve taxation, reorganize trade routes, and increase efficiency within colonial government. These reforms reflected the monarchy's recognition that the empire needed to adapt if it wished to remain competitive in a rapidly changing global environment. Yet implementing such reforms across distant territories was never simple, and many policies produced mixed results. Despite these challenges, the Spanish Empire still possessed enormous geographic reach and cultural influence. Spanish language, religion, and legal traditions remained deeply rooted throughout much of the Americas. Colonial cities such as Mexico City, Lima, and Havana continued functioning as major centers of administration, trade, and intellectual life. Universities, churches, and government institutions helped maintain the imperial system that had developed over the previous 2 centuries. The difference was that Spain no longer stood alone at the center of global expansion. The interconnected world created during the Age of Conquest had grown larger and more competitive. New empires, new trade routes, and new economic systems were emerging alongside the old. Spain remained a powerful participant in this world, but the balance of influence was slowly shifting as other nations began shaping the global networks that Spain had once dominated. As the balance of global power continued shifting during the 18th century, Spanish rulers increasingly recognized that the empire needed significant reforms if it was to remain effective. The vast colonial system that had grown during the Age of Conquest had developed slowly over centuries, often through improvisation rather than careful planning. Administrative offices, trade regulations, and taxation systems had been added piece by piece as new territories were incorporated into the empire. By the early 1700s, many royal officials believed that these institutions had become inefficient and difficult to manage. The Spanish monarchy, therefore, began introducing a series of reforms designed to strengthen imperial control and improve the functioning of colonial government. These reforms became especially important after a major political transition in Spain itself. In 1700, the death of the last Habsburg king of Spain triggered a European conflict known as the War of the Spanish Succession. When the war ended in 1713, a new royal dynasty, the Bourbons, took control of the Spanish throne. The Bourbon monarchs brought with them new ideas about administration and governance, influenced in part by developments in France and other European states that were centralizing political authority and modernizing their bureaucracies. Spanish rulers now sought to apply similar principles to the management of their empire. One of the main goals of the Bourbon reforms was to strengthen the authority of the crown over colonial territories. Spanish officials believed that local elites in the Americas had gradually gained too much influence over regional economies and politics. Merchants, landowners, and colonial administrators often developed strong local networks that allowed them to shape economic activity in ways that did not always benefit the royal treasury. To address this problem, the monarchy reorganized parts of the colonial administration. New officials known as intendants were appointed to supervise taxation, finance, and economic development in various regions. These administrators reported directly to the crown and were expected to enforce royal policies more efficiently than earlier officials had done. Trade policy was another area targeted for reform. For much of the empire's history, Spain had attempted to control colonial commerce through strict regulations that required most trade to pass through specific ports and official fleets. While these policies had once helped the crown monitor valuable shipments such as silver, they also limited the flexibility of colonial economies. By the 18th century, many Spanish officials believed that loosening some of these restrictions might stimulate economic growth and increase tax revenues. As a result, the crown gradually allowed a wider range of Spanish ports to participate in colonial trade and permitted more frequent commercial exchanges between Spain and the Americas. These changes helped expand legal trade while also reducing the incentive for smuggling that had long existed in colonial markets. The Bourbon reforms also included efforts to strengthen Spain's military presence in key parts of the empire. Fortifications were improved in important Caribbean ports such as Havana, and naval forces were expanded to protect shipping routes from rival European powers. Colonial militias were reorganized, often including locally born elites who were given new responsibilities for defending imperial territory. These changes reflected the growing awareness that Spain needed stronger defenses in a world where multiple empires were competing for influence across the oceans. Despite the ambitions behind these reforms, their results were complex. In some regions, economic activity increased as trade became more flexible and administrative systems more organized. Yet the reforms also created tensions within colonial societies. Local elites sometimes resented the growing authority of officials sent from Spain, especially when those officials attempted to collect higher taxes or enforce new regulations. These tensions did not immediately threaten the empire's stability, but they revealed that the relationship between Spain and its American territories was becoming more complicated. By the late 18th century, the Spanish Empire had become a system that combined centuries-old traditions with new attempts at modernization. The reforms introduced by the Bourbon monarchy demonstrated that Spain was still actively trying to maintain its place in a changing global world. Yet they also hinted at deeper questions about how such a vast empire could continue functioning in an era when economic power, political ideas, and global competition were evolving rapidly. During the late 18th century, the reforms introduced by the Spanish monarchy began producing consequences that few royal planners had fully anticipated. The Bourbon reforms had been designed to strengthen imperial authority, improve economic efficiency, and defend the empire against foreign competition. In some ways, they succeeded. Trade increased between Spain and its American territories, colonial administrations became more organized, and military defenses were strengthened in key ports across the Caribbean and the Pacific. Yet these same reforms also altered the internal balance of power within colonial societies, creating new tensions that slowly reshaped the relationship between Spain and its overseas territories. One of the most important changes involved the role of local elites in Spanish America. For generations, many wealthy landowners, merchants, and administrators born in the Americas known as criollos had played an important role in colonial economic life. They managed estates, operated mines, financed trade, and participated in local government councils. Although they remained loyal to the Spanish crown, they also developed strong identities tied to the regions where they lived. The Bourbon reforms, however, often placed greater authority in the hands of officials sent directly from Spain. These peninsular administrators were expected to enforce new tax policies and supervise colonial economies more closely. While the monarchy saw this as a way to strengthen royal control, many criollos viewed it as a reduction of their own influence within the empire they had helped sustain. Economic reforms also had mixed effects. The expansion of legal trade allowed colonial merchants to conduct business more freely with Spain and with other Spanish ports. Ports such as Buenos Aires, which had once been relatively isolated from major trade routes, became more active commercial centers under the new policies. Increased trade stimulated agriculture, mining, and manufacturing in several regions, yet higher levels of taxation accompanied many of these reforms as the Spanish crown sought to increase revenue from its overseas territories. These taxes supported the empire's military defenses and administrative institutions, but they also placed new burdens on colonial economies. In some areas, protests and uprisings occurred when communities resisted tax increases or labor demands. The reforms also influenced indigenous and rural communities in ways that were sometimes disruptive. Efforts to increase tribute payments or reorganize local administration could alter long-standing relationships between colonial officials and indigenous leaders. In certain regions of Spanish America, these changes contributed to large-scale uprisings. One of the most notable occurred in the Andes in 1780, when a leader known as Tupac Amaru II led a rebellion that challenged colonial authority and demanded reforms to labor and tribute systems. Although the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it revealed how deeply colonial policies could affect the lives of communities far from the centers of imperial administration. At the same time, new ideas about government and political rights were circulating across the Atlantic world. Intellectual movements, often described as the Enlightenment, encouraged discussions about liberty, representation, and the legitimacy of political authority. These ideas spread through books, universities, and conversations among educated elites in both Europe and the Americas. While many colonial leaders remained loyal to the Spanish monarchy, they were also increasingly aware that political systems in other parts of the world were beginning to change. The American Revolution in the British colonies during the late 18th century demonstrated that European colonial systems were not permanent. News of such events traveled widely, prompting conversations within Spanish-American societies about the future of imperial governance. Despite these growing tensions, the Spanish Empire still remained intact at the end of the 18th century. Colonial institutions continued functioning, trade routes remained active, and the monarchy maintained authority across vast territories. Yet beneath this stability, the empire had entered a new stage of uncertainty. Economic reforms, political ideas, and local ambitions were gradually reshaping colonial societies. The global system that Spain had helped create centuries earlier was still operating, but the forces moving within that system were beginning to point toward a future that no longer depended entirely on Spanish imperial control. By the end of the 18th century, the Spanish Empire had already shaped the world in ways that would last far beyond the era of conquest itself. For more than 200 years, Spanish ships had crossed oceans, colonial cities had grown across the Americas, and silver from distant mountains had circulated through markets from Europe to Asia. Even as political tensions slowly emerged within the empire, the networks created during this long period of expansion had already woven continents together in ways that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The Age of Global Conquest had not simply produced a powerful empire, it had transformed how distant societies interacted with one another. One of the most lasting legacies of the Spanish Empire can be seen in the geography of language and culture across the Americas. Spanish became the dominant language in vast regions stretching from northern Mexico to the southern Andes. Alongside language came legal systems, administrative traditions, and religious institutions that shaped the development of cities and communities for centuries. Churches, universities, municipal councils, and colonial courts created structures of governance that continued to influence many societies even after the imperial system itself changed. Today, many of the largest cities in the Americas, Mexico City, Lima, Bogotá, and others, still reflect the urban patterns first established during the colonial period, with central plazas, cathedrals, and government buildings arranged in the designs introduced during Spanish rule. At the same time, the legacy of the Spanish Empire is also visible in the deep cultural blending that occurred throughout its territories. The societies of Latin America were never purely European creations. Indigenous traditions, African cultural influences, and European institutions interacted continuously, producing new forms of identity that were unique to the colonial world. Languages absorbed words from multiple traditions, cuisines combined ingredients from different continents, and artistic styles reflected the exchange of ideas between cultures. Music, religious festivals, and community rituals often carried traces of these mixed histories, reminding later generations that colonial societies were shaped by people whose ancestors came from many parts of the world. The economic networks created during the Spanish imperial era also left a lasting imprint on global trade. When silver from the mines of the Americas flowed across the Atlantic and the Pacific, it helped establish commercial routes that linked Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas into a single economic system. Merchants learned to navigate these connections, developing patterns of exchange that continued evolving long after the earliest Spanish fleets had sailed. Some historians describe this period as the beginning of the first sustained global economy, a system in which goods, currency, and information moved regularly between continents. In this sense, the Spanish Empire did not simply expand across the world, it helped create the framework through which the modern world economy would later develop. Yet the legacy of the empire also includes the human consequences of conquest and colonization. Indigenous societies experienced dramatic changes as disease, labor systems, and colonial rule altered long-established ways of life. African communities, brought to the Americas through the slave trade, contributed deeply to the cultures of the region while also enduring systems of forced labor. These histories form an essential part of understanding the Spanish imperial experience. The world that emerged from this period was shaped by both cooperation and conflict, by cultural exchange as well as by inequality and hardship. Looking back across the centuries, the Spanish Empire can therefore be understood as one of the earliest experiments in global connection. Ships carried silver, silk, and spices across oceans. Missionaries, merchants, and migrants moved between continents, and cities across the Americas became places where people from different worlds encountered one another. The empire did not remain unchanged forever, but the networks it created continued influencing global history long after the first conquistadors had crossed the Atlantic. In this sense, the story of the Spanish Empire is not only about power or conquest, it is also about the beginning of a new kind of world, one where distant regions were no longer isolated, but increasingly connected through trade, culture, and shared history. Understanding this transformation helps explain why events that began with a few ships sailing westward in the 15th century eventually shaped societies across the globe for generations to come. As the centuries passed, the global networks first formed during the Spanish imperial era continued evolving in ways that extended far beyond Spain itself. The ships that once carried silver across oceans had helped establish patterns of movement that later empires, merchants, and nations would follow. Trade routes, linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, became permanent features of the world economy, Ports that had grown during the Spanish period, such as Veracruz, Havana, Manila, and Lima, remained important centers of commerce long after the first age of conquest had faded into history. The system Spain had built did not disappear. Instead, it became part of a much larger global structure that continued expanding through later centuries. One of the most important long-term consequences of this early global system was the transformation of communication and exchange between distant societies. Before the 15th century, many regions of the world had developed largely independent of one another. The civilizations of the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Africa had their own trade networks and cultural traditions, but regular interaction between all these regions was limited. The expansion of Spanish and other European maritime routes created something different. Goods, people, and information could now travel across oceans with increasing regularity. Over time, this movement allowed ideas and technologies to circulate more widely than ever before. Crops, for example, moved between continents in ways that permanently changed agriculture around the world. Plants native to the Americas, such as maize, potatoes, and tomatoes, eventually became staples in regions far beyond their original homes. In return, animals and crops from Europe and Asia reshaped farming practices throughout the Americas. These exchanges were not always peaceful or balanced, yet they demonstrate how deeply the early imperial networks reshaped global life. A merchant in Mexico City might sell goods that had originated in China. A farmer in the Andes might cultivate crops that had first been brought from Europe. Communities across the Spanish Empire participated in exchanges that connected them indirectly to markets thousands of kilometers away. Even people who never traveled far from their hometowns often lived within an economic system that stretched across oceans. The Age of Global Conquest had therefore created a new reality. Local lives were now tied to distant events happening elsewhere in the world. The political consequences of this interconnected world would become clearer in later centuries. As trade expanded and ideas traveled more freely, societies began reconsidering how power and authority should be organized. Colonial territories developed their own economic interests and political identities. At the same time, the spread of education and intellectual debate encouraged new discussions about governance, rights, and representation. These conversations would eventually influence major historical changes across the Americas and Europe during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Although those events belong to a later chapter of history, their origins can often be traced back to the global connections first created during the era of Spanish expansion. Another lasting effect of the Spanish Empire lies in the cultural landscapes that still exist today. Cities founded during the colonial period remain central to modern national life throughout Latin America. Architectural styles developed during the imperial era continue shaping public spaces, while languages and traditions passed down through generations reflect centuries of cultural exchange. Music, art, and religious celebrations often carry elements drawn from indigenous, African, and European traditions alike. These cultural forms reveal how deeply the history of empire became woven into everyday life. Looking across this long history, it becomes clear that the Spanish Empire was not simply a political system that rose and declined. It was also a historical process that helped transform how the world was connected. Oceans that once separated continents became pathways for travel and exchange. Societies that had evolved independently began interacting in ways that reshaped economies, cultures, and identities. The global world familiar today, where distant regions are linked through trade, communication, and shared challenges, can trace part of its origins back to the networks formed during the Spanish imperial era. The story of the Spanish Empire therefore invites a quieter reflection. Empires often appear powerful when viewed through maps and records of conquest, yet their deepest influence sometimes lies in the connections they leave behind. Long after armies disappear and political borders change, the systems of exchange they created can continue shaping the lives of people who may never even realize how those connections first began. As the long arc of the Spanish Empire fades into the distance of history, What remains most striking is not only the scale of its territory, but the kind of world it helped bring into existence. In the late 15th century, when a small group of ships sailed west from Spain, the Atlantic Ocean still seemed like a boundary between separate worlds. Europe, the Americas, Asia, and Africa were connected only through indirect and often fragile networks of contact. Within a few generations, that situation had changed dramatically. Ships crossed oceans every year, silver flowed between continents, and cities across the Americas became places where people from distant cultures encountered one another for the first time. The Spanish Empire played a central role in that transformation. Its fleets linked the Atlantic and Pacific worlds. Its colonial cities became hubs where merchants, missionaries, administrators, and travelers exchanged goods and ideas. Its silver mines supplied the currency that allowed trade to expand across vast distances. Through these networks, the empire helped create something entirely new in human history, a world where economic systems, cultural traditions, and political events on one continent could influence lives on another. Yet the story of this empire also reminds us that global connection is never simple. The same networks that allowed knowledge and goods to travel across oceans also carried conflict, inequality, and human suffering. Indigenous societies were transformed by disease and colonial rule. African communities were drawn into the Atlantic world through the brutal system of slavery. Settlers and administrators attempted to build new societies while navigating unfamiliar landscapes and cultures. The Age of Global Conquest, therefore, produced both remarkable exchanges and profound challenges, leaving legacies that are still visible today. Over the centuries that followed, the Spanish Empire itself changed and eventually gave way to new political realities. Nations formed, borders shifted, and other global powers emerged. Yet many of the connections first established during the era of Spanish expansion continued shaping the world long afterward. Languages spoken across the Americas, cities built during the colonial period, and trade routes linking distant markets all carry traces of this earlier moment when continents became part of a shared system. Today, when goods travel between continents in a matter of days and information moves across the planet in seconds, it can be easy to forget how recent the idea of a connected world truly is. For most of human history, societies developed within relatively separate spheres. The Spanish Empire was one of the earliest forces to bind those spheres together on a global scale. Its ships crossed oceans, its merchants bridged cultures, and its institutions attempted to govern lands separated by thousands of kilometers. This brings us back to the quiet paradox that began the story. The Spanish Empire helped create one of the first truly global systems, a network linking Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia through trade, culture, and power. Yet the same vast connections that made the empire possible also made it difficult to control. Wealth flowed outward, rival powers entered the same oceans, and distant societies began shaping the system in ways Spain could not fully direct. The empire had connected the world so effectively that the world itself grew larger than the empire that helped create it. And perhaps that leaves us with a final reflection. When a civilization succeeds in connecting distant parts of the world, it does more than expand its own power. It sets in motion forces that will continue moving long after its own influence begins to fade. If the Spanish Empire helped build the first truly global world, then a quiet question remains for every later generation that lives within that connected system. When a world becomes fully connected, does any single power truly control it anymore?